There's a strange kind of weight that comes with being labeled someone's safety net, their fallback option when life doesn't go according to plan. For years, I carried that title like an invisible chain, bound by the unspoken expectation that my purpose was to step in whenever my parents needed rescuing. They called me their backup plan, a phrase they tossed around casually as if it were a compliment rather than a burden. At first, I convinced myself it was just part of being a dutiful son, a role I had embraced without question, but over time, the resentment grew heavier, until one day I realized I couldn't breathe under its pressure. It all started when I was young, though back then, I didn't see it for what it truly was. My parents weren't bad people. They worked hard and did their best to provide for our family. But somewhere along the way, they began relying on me, not just for help around the house or occasional support, but as a crutch to lean on whenever things went wrong. When bills piled up, they turned to me. When arguments erupted between them, they expected me to mediate. And when opportunities arose for them to chase their dreams, they left me behind to pick up the pieces. By the time I reached adulthood, this dynamic had become ingrained in our relationship. I moved out of the house. At 22, eager to build a life of my own, only to find myself tethered to them by an endless string of obligations. Every phone call seemed to carry an ulterior motive. Can you lend us some money? Or, we need your advice on this situation. At first, I complied willingly, believing it was my duty to support them. After all, wasn't that what families did? Sacrifice for one another? But as the years passed, the requests became more frequent and more demanding. A loan here, a favor there, until it felt like my entire existence revolved around solving their problems. Meanwhile, my own life stagnated. Career aspirations took a back seat to emergencies I hadn't caused. Relationships faltered because I was too busy playing mediator in theirs. Friends drifted away, tired of hearing about how much I was giving and receiving so little in return. Yet still, I stayed, telling myself that someday they would recognize my efforts, that someday they would stop needing me so much. That day never came. Instead, the breaking point arrived unexpectedly during a family dinner, a rare occasion where everyone gathered under one roof. The conversation began innocently enough, with updates on work, health, and other mundane topics. Then, midway through dessert, my mother turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You know, Leo," she said, her tone light but deliberate, "it's such a relief having you as our backup plan. If anything ever happens, we know we can count on you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Backup plan. That's what I was to them. Not a son, not a person with dreams and desires of his own, but a contingency strategy. A fail-safe to cushion their mistakes. I stared at her, searching for any hint of irony or jest, but found none. She meant every word. "And what exactly does that mean?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "That I'm supposed to drop everything whenever you need me? That my life is secondary to yours?" She blinked, startled by my reaction. "Of course not," she replied quickly, though her hesitation betrayed her. "We just appreciate knowing you're there for us." "For you," I corrected, my anger bubbling closer to the surface. "Not for me, never for me." The table fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. My father cleared his throat, attempting to diffuse the situation. "Come on, Leo, don't take it so personally. We're grateful for everything you've done." "Grateful?" I echoed, incredulous. "You treat me like a lifeline, like I exist solely to fix your problems, and now you're telling me to stop taking it personally? Do you even realize how much I've sacrificed for you? How many times I've put my own life on hold because you needed me to?" They exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. For once, they had no ready answer, no excuse to justify their behavior. Instead, they sat there, silent and defensive, as if waiting for me to apologize for speaking the truth. I didn't. That night, I lay awake replaying the argument in my mind, each word echoing louder than the last. Something inside me shifted, a realization that I couldn't keep living this way, trapped in a cycle of obligation and neglect. I loved my parents, but loving them didn't mean sacrificing myself entirely. It didn't mean losing sight of who I was or abandoning the life I wanted to build. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future without them pulling me back every time I tried to move forward. The decision to leave wasn't easy. It required careful planning and a level of resolve I hadn't known I possessed. Over the next few months, I quietly prepared, saving money, securing a new job in a different city, and arranging housing far. Enough away to create distance, but close enough to visit if necessary. I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my siblings, and certainly not my parents. I knew they wouldn't understand, and frankly, I didn't owe them an explanation. When the day finally came, I packed my belongings into a rented truck and drove away before dawn, leaving behind a note that simply read, "I need to find my own path. Please respect that." It wasn't dramatic or accusatory. It didn't need to be. The message was clear. I was done being their backup plan. The weeks that followed were both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, I felt lighter, freer than I had in years. For the first time, I could focus on myself without guilt or distraction. I explored new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and threw myself into my career with renewed energy. On the other hand, the absence of familiar faces and routines left a void I hadn't anticipated. Nights were the hardest, when loneliness crept in and doubts whispered that maybe I had made a mistake. Then came the calls. At first, they were frantic, filled with questions and accusations. Why did you leave? How could you abandon us? What will we do without you? I ignored most of them, letting voicemails pile up unanswered. Eventually, the tone shifted, from anger to pleading, from blame to regret. My mother's voice softened, her messages tinged with vulnerability. "We miss you," she admitted in one recording. "Please come home." For a moment, I considered it. Part of me longed to return, to reconcile and rebuild what I had left behind. But another part, the stronger, wiser part, knew better. Going back would mean slipping back into the same patterns, resuming the role I had fought so hard to escape. So instead, I sent a single text. "I love you, but I can't be who you want me to be anymore. Let me live my life, and maybe someday we can start fresh." Time has a way of healing wounds, even those inflicted by love. Slowly, painfully, my parents began to adjust to my absence. They reached out less frequently, their messages becoming shorter and more reflective. In them, I detected a subtle shift, an acknowledgement of their mistakes, however reluctant. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As for me, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Leaving wasn't just an act of defiance. It was an act of self-preservation, a declaration that I deserved more than the scraps of affection they had been willing to offer. Life isn't always fair, and forgiveness isn't something you grant easily, not when trust has been broken so thoroughly. But sometimes the hardest choices lead to the greatest growth. In the end, my parents didn't just lose a son. They gained a man who refused to settle for less than he deserved. And while scars remain, they serve as reminders not of pain, but of resilience. Because love, even flawed and complicated love, is worth fighting for.